Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to our study session this evening. Tonight we're going to have Dr. Craig Gilbert, the Associate Superintendent of Pre-K through 12 Educational Services, who is going to present the CUSD policy transition from ASBA to the Trust Model Policy Program. Dr. Gilbert.
Madam President, members of the board, thank you for this time so that we can share with you how the team has worked to move from and transition from the current policy that we have to the trust model policy. I'd like to start by thanking the board for your patience as we've worked through this. There's been a lot of information to share with you and go through this as we work to transition this policy. But I'd also like to thank the team, the administrative team, because it's a pretty heavy lift as it is, but when you're working together as a team, it does make it easier. And our team, I think, has done a phenomenal job in going through all of this information and preparing it so that it can be in front of you today. With that being said, early in this process, it was brought to you by Mr. Narducci in us transitioning to the trust model policy from our current policy. And the advantages that were shared was one, it would reduce the number of policies and procedures, because our current policy is pretty robust in the sense of the number of documents. The organization of the policies will give us some ease of use. The policy would be driven and focused on statute, and really fortunate that the policy updates that we would have would be coming from partner firms such as Denise Lobrit from Udall-Shumway, which is our district legal counsel, who has been involved in the development of the trust policy and has assisted us throughout this process. One of the big pieces of this is the policy is broken into 5 chapters: governance, district governance, administration, business operations, human resources, and students. You'll see there are 5 chapters, which is a drastic change from our current policy that has 12. As we went through these documents, it was, in looking at going to 5, it's really helpful because now when you're looking for something, I think it's going to be easier to go through the different chapters based on its title alone is going to help you get through the information. I think it will be easier for district administration, site administration, parents, community, to be able to go through this, especially our parents, and it be very succinct in it by chapters, instead of it being difficult, because sometimes when you're looking in our current policy, if you're looking for some information, you have to look in a couple different places in order to get the full picture. So as we prepared to transition from our current policy to the trust model, the primary focus and purpose guided our work. And our primary focus was really not to change policy, but to transition from one policy management organization to another. That's really important as we look at what we're bringing in front of you. The goal in this wasn't to change policy. If we took that challenge on, we would be working on this for a few years, because we would be going policy by policy, wordsmithing or changing or figuring out what we wanted. The whole focus on this was being able to transition the policy, have a baseline of that policy, which would be in alignment with what we currently have, and then be able to move forward. The purpose as we did this work was looking at reducing the number of policies, as I was sharing, focus on statute, really looking at what's the statute that established the policy. In some cases, in our previous, there might be policy that we have, but it's not necessarily based on a statute. It might be clarifying something or giving you more information. Work closer with our partnering firms, as I mentioned, especially if you have legislation and you need these policies to be reviewed and updated in a timely manner because of legislation, as well as then looking again, streamlining it and the ease of use as you move forward. So the initial steps that were taken prior to the transition, as you know and possibly remember, that on that it was brought to you by Mr. Narducci to get approval for us to even look at and move forward in transitioning policy, and that took place on September 13th of 23. Then we developed a plan to preserve our district existing policies, which is really important because as we move from this, if something comes up from that, something that happened in the past, we have to make sure we go back to the policy that was in existence at that time. So that becomes really important. Then we worked with the trust to obtain one specific crosswalk. That crosswalk gave us information on our current policy and how it aligned with the new policy so that we can look at that information to make some determinations. And then we received the new policy in document format so that we can utilize it to begin our process. That was the baseline of where we started, and it had different information on it. I'll go into that a little more. And then we also had a checklist. When we looked at the crosswalk, we had to look at the policies and say, did this policy of our current match the new? We had to look and see that there are times where our current policy might have 5 policies that was reduced into 1 policy in the new model. And some of that is because in our current policy, you'll see there is some redundancy in things that occur. It's not that it's not good or bad, it's just redundancy. So if you can narrow it down as to what you're working on. And then again, some of it might be more clarification and not necessarily connected to a statute. Then we had to really focus and establish a specific timeline. We had to establish roles and responsibilities and those that were going to be leading this work. Review and compare the current policy to the new policy, develop policy recommendations in the sense of after everything is reviewed and it's looked at, okay, how am I recommending that we move forward with it? Establish policy review dates with the board, which was our work sessions that we had, and then determining target dates to bring this to you as a board. One that you'll see later tonight as an information item, and then coming back the following meeting as an approval action. The review process summary, it was extensive. I will tell you, it was very extensive in working through because, again, we weren't just looking at the new policy. We were looking at current policy. We had to review a number of pieces. The policy was divided among district level administrators. This became real important, and it was an important piece for me, especially as I worked with Mr. Narducci, because there was a time that when policy changed, it was only he and I that was working on the policy, going back and forth. And so having the team be a part of looking at it and separating it, one, because we have administrators that work with specific parts of the policy on a daily basis or weekly basis. So it was real important that they were the ones that were reviewing and looking, does the policy match up? Is there something missing? What's going on there? The other piece that was important is we need to make sure that we're building capacity within our administrative team, especially up at the district level, of how to review, how to implement new policy, how to review it. What does that mean? What does it look like? What areas should I be going and looking at statute? When should I be talking to legal? Those type of things become really important. And then finally, actually not finally, I'm sorry, and then also with reviewing consistent and current policy, one of the things that was important is looking at terms. So you'll see in our existing policy, it's policy and regulation, and in the trust policy, it's policy and procedures. So it may seem little, but when you're having a conversation, it's important to make sure that you're using the proper term and understanding the definition with that. And then finally, in this process, making sure we gathered feedback from site administrators, from our legal counsel, from our practitioners out in the field. Does this make sense? Here's what it looks like. Is this occurring? What do we need to do? And that was a request that we asked from everybody as we're moving forward. So again, as we're going through the review process, then we had recommendation process, how we were going to present and review. This information was presented and reviewed in the superintendent's cabinet. So let's just say we worked on chapters 1 and 2. and now we bring that information to the cabinet, or we brought it into a department meeting so that we can share, this is what we're seeing, this is how it compared, this is the information that we want to keep or we want to move forward on. Proposed policies were presented to the governing board, as you know, in our 4 planning meetings that we had in order to get your feedback. We had touch points established throughout all of this process where I worked with those that were leading their area, and it may be, how is everything going? Do you have some questions? Is that something we need to take to legal? Have them take a look at it. And we also were fortunate that we had Denise Lolbrit from Udall-Shumway. She was available throughout this process so that if I had any questions or if any of our leads had questions, we can get some clarification. That was very helpful, especially as we're going through, because I will tell you that, and just to be transparent, the amount of policy that we have becomes very important that you're versed in where to find it, because you may not always know the little particulars of it. That's why it's key to make sure that you're always being versed, you're always reading, you're always getting that information. So how do you take all of this information and try to put it in a realm so that it's in a location, it's organized, and you have over 10 or so people that are going to be moving in and out of this documentation, cleaning things up or adding language. So we went with a file management system to really focus on utilizing our Microsoft Teams. In that, we utilize folders. The titles of those folders was the Master Trust folder, where this is where all your master documents were, a working document folder, where all the team used to put all their information in as they were working on it. Then we had our board review folder that was specific to all of you, so that information was put in there and you knew exactly where to go. We tried to streamline it so you weren't trying to sift through a ton of things that weren't necessary for you. And then the final policy folder, which nothing on our team, but I kept it very minimal to how many people had access to this, because this is where all the final documents were going to go so that then we can bring them to you. So in the Master Trust folder for all of the area leads, those that were leading on all the policy, in that folder, we made sure that we had in a Word format chapters 1 through 5, so that they can actually pull it and move it into their working folder. They can update it, they can edit it, they can highlight, they can make comments, they can do a number of things so that they have it. But it was the master document, so it was always pull from there, don't change in there. Also, the crosswalk was in there, as I shared, and that gives you the comparison of the current policy moving to the new policy. Timelines are in there because there was a presentation that was given so that you can see what are the timelines, what is the policy review process, what are the edits and the recommendations, how do we move forward with that. Chapter responsibilities, made sure that there was a list that anyone can go to and take a look to remind themselves what their responsibilities were, what policies were theirs, what areas they had to focus on, and then a checklist. So the reviewing of the policy consisted of really being targeted in our focus. It was really review the ASBA policy and compare it to the trust policy. In that, using our focus and our purpose that I shared earlier with you to work on that. Also determining if CUSD made changes to the original ASBA policy. We are known to Chandlerize things that we do. And so over the years when we get policy that comes from ASBA and there are changes that need to be made, staying within the statute, staying within the law, there might be language that we have in our policy that's very specific to Chandler. So not only did we have to review the ASBA policy and the new policy, we had to look at the current policy to see were there things that we put in there that were necessary to move over to the new policy as well. So questions to ask throughout the process, and this was put in place. There was a little more pieces to this for the team, but it gave them some things to ask themselves as they're going through the policy to help guide them as they were working through. One is, does the trust policy meet the district need as it's written? So when you look at the policy and the trust policy, and you look at the policy that we're transitioning from, in its language, how it's written, does it make sense and it's covering everything that it needs to? That's a question to be looked at. Do we still need the current policy and it is not covered in the trust policy? So there may be something that we have in policy and it's not covered in the trust because the trust is really looking more at statute. A policy might be more clarification, and it might be a policy that's covered in other, or it may not be covered in other places. Sometimes it is. Do we need to keep that? We need to know that information. If current policy is no longer needed, it was important for the team to denote on the tracking sheet so that when we meet with you, we can share with you that this policy is not needed anymore and what the purpose was, why. It was covered in another policy. It was a regulation and the policy says the same thing, those type of things. Is there additional language that's needed to be added? And it could be something that was specific to Chandler. It may be something that it's a practice that we do or it's part of what we do within our policy. Do we need to keep that? If additional language is needed in the trust policy, make sure you denote it, that you're adding it and highlighting it so that when we're going through, we have that as a record of what we added or what we've changed or what we needed to do. And then comments, our leads were able to add comments into the documents. Once they added a comment, it came to me in an email and I can see what question they may have. I can go in and answer it and it shoots it right back, or I can go through and see that they made a change. I might send a comment asking some questions of them as to why we went this way and not that. How is this part of what we normally do? Those kind of questions. But ultimately, I shared with the team, because we're trying to make sure that we are targeted and condense this information. If the trust policy meets the district's needs, we can accept the policy as written. So if we look at the new policy and it's covering everything that's within our current policy, we can keep it and take it as it stands for that policy. As you know, you unfortunately had to deal with me 4 times on your calendar. We met on October 22nd and we covered chapters 1 and 2. On October 20th, we made sure that the folder was available to you so that you can review the information prior to coming to the meeting. So we always try to do that. So you'll see October 27th, we went over chapters 1 and 2. December 15th, we went over chapter 3. February 16th, chapter 4, and March 8th, chapter 5. I will say I'm very happy that Mr. Narducci agreed for us to take this year to go through this process and take our time to make sure that it fits in what we need it to do and that there's nothing missed as we go through this document. So during the board planning sessions, we made sure we had the documents were available to you and in advance so that you can ask questions, you can review, you can have that information. Based on our conversations, it sounds like the time that you had was enough to be able to do that. Documents that we reviewed, we looked at policies that were being removed, and I want to be careful of saying policies being removed. It meant that these policies were already being covered in the new, and so there were times where you might have had 3 or 4 policies in our current, and going to the new, it was all covered in one. So what was being removed, or it was policy that wasn't based in statute, and the question became, did we need to continue with that, and was it addressed somewhere else within the policy? We looked at the policies being recommended to keep moving forward with, and then we also worked with where are the new locations, because that was one of the questions that you asked as a board, is if this policy is no longer moving forward from ASBA to the new trust policy, where does it live? So it could live in a process, it could be it's already being done in HR, or it could be in our mission, because there's a number of things and a number of policies that focused on this is the goal of the district. It was a policy. Well, it wasn't based on statute, it was just that was kind of some introductory things that go into it that may not have been needed. And then with that, each chapter was reviewed in the planning. So we went through each chapter, scrolled through what was changed, what options we had, and then we had time for questions, discussions, and questions throughout that time. So again, in the board review folder, that gave you all the information that you needed in order to evaluate before we came together on those 4 dates that I shared for us to be able to discuss. Then we look at the policy development approval process. Once we went through as a team, reviewed and compared policy, made edits, and received feedback from you at the planning meetings from the board, then that final document was moved into the final folder that I talked about. When it moved to that folder, that's when I went in, cleaned up edits, cleaned up highlights, cleaned up information based on our conversation. And then my assistant went through and formatted it and make sure it was prepared so that we can bring it to you in a clean format at this board meeting. And then again, we'll bring it back for action. So next steps, one is today, where during this board meeting, we will have an information item to ask for, to share, to have this conversation, which is what I'm doing now, and then I'll bring it as an information item. And then after that, on April 10th, we will bring this back to you for approval. So then once it's approved by the board, then we will make sure that we have it prepared so that we can transmit it to the trust so that they can make sure that they do their review of it and formatting that they need that maybe we didn't do so that it can be prepared to implement and launch on July 1, 2024 for the next school year. One last thing I do want to share that as we focused on, as we were going through this process from day one in meeting with administration, meeting with the district administrative team, we know that as we were changing and having to make some adjustments, I shared with the principals, as you're walking around your campus, start looking at things that are posted on your campus, on your website, all those different areas, because that's going to have to change, especially if it's referencing a policy, if it's referencing a regulation, all of those. So it was really making sure, update documents, making sure that we're ready for next year, because come July 1, if the board approves in the April meeting, come July 1, this will be the policy documents that we're utilizing. So we also had to make sure that we understand in managing forms. Forms don't come to you as an approval. Forms are what we're using to address policy pieces. So we want to make sure that forms are available for our administrators, our parents, our community, that's pertaining to them when there's a form going on with a policy. So we're working on and making sure we have that managed so that it's ease of use. Moving information from policy to process. There are some areas that it was a policy, but it wasn't connected to any statute, but it is a process that we use. So making sure that we don't lose that and we make sure that it's still in a process document of things that we're doing. Again, when I was looking at our current policy, you'll see there's some redundance of things where you see it as in the policy and the same language is exactly in the regulation. And then again, as I brought up, updating policy references throughout the district, such as postings around the district and school websites, student handbooks, course catalogs, all those type of things we've been working on since this process started to make sure that if you see it, make note of it in a handbook, make note of anything that you're using. If it's in a syllabus, anything you're referencing, because we need to be able to change those references to the new policy language. So with that, although I wish this process took as long as this presentation, but it didn't. As I said, it came to you starting in September. We've had 4 meetings since then, starting in October. We met early October with the team to make sure that they had we rolled everything out at the same time because we wanted to make sure those that were going to be working on chapters had all the way up until this time to be working on it, because as you went through, especially when you get into chapter 5 and the student part, there was a lot of hands that had to go in there because of the different policies and who it affected. So with that, I will take any questions you have.
Thank you, Dr. Gilbert. I do have one, I guess, short question that you probably can't answer accurately, but
Well, thank you.
approximately how many person hours did this process take across all of the departments and with your time?
You're right. I can't, well, it took a long time. And what I would say is, I would probably move it more to out of contract hours, in the sense of when we're doing it, because we didn't change any of our current job responsibilities and things that we were supposed to be doing. We just kind of added this in, which is why I really wanted to make sure that the team had this information early, so that if there was times that they can block out time on their calendar just to focus on this, they could. So again, it was probably a combination of both, but a lot of it was outside of what necessarily would be numbers. But it was quite a bit.
Madam President, I think Dr. Gilbert's being quite modest on this. When we introduced it to you in September and came to you with a year that it was going to take, they hit the ground running. The whole cabinet did, and Dr. Gilbert was essential in getting everything organized. As a matter of fact, he came to me and said, this is something I can do, and I want to do it. And I was like, going, great, because he's really good at policy. I mean, he and I worked together for a decade doing policy together. But the cabinet really owned it, and their work was amazing, because we all have full-time jobs with whatever comes in and whatever we change. And so you just have to add that on top of, and they all did a fantastic job. Dr. Gilbert led the group in a great way. Denise Olbritt, Studal Shumway, great support. The trust was a great support as well. And you were all a great support. I just want to give you that, because you came to planning sessions on each chapter, had great conversations with it, and good questions. And so I do appreciate everybody's effort in this. Some districts do it a little different. They get it done in a couple of months. I think we did it correctly and took the good part of the year to recommend this transition to you.
And I'm sorry, if I could add, the other thing I think that was very helpful in this process is because it wasn't just one or two people, and it was the whole team, especially looking at policy in the areas that they're in, it gave us some clarity on some areas that we think may need to be adjusted or changed. Again, our focus in this was not to change policy, but there was a number of us that looked at it and were like, I want to change this now. I'm like, hold on, because we got to get this done first, or we'll never get there. And board included came up with some things that we need to look at, as we go. So once we do that, then we'll look at what possible changes are needed.
And I would like to express my appreciation for everyone who did work on this, because I know it is a ton of work. It takes a lot of time, and the work is very, very detail-oriented, and I appreciate everyone who participated in this in cabinet, on the board, and even all those people who are formatting things and getting this into final format. It is a lot of work, and we appreciate it. Are there any other questions from the board? Yes, Mr. Worth.
So it's kind of a statement, see if it's true or false. I think what you've done is greatly simplified our policy manual. Would that be
Yeah,
accurate?
I will say that the trust did it, and then we worked within that.
But the
And so,
whole-
yes, it made it simple, especially going
document is
from
totally
12
easier to work
chapters to 5.
The new document is way easier to work with, correct?
Way easy to work with, easier to navigate, even for, I think, our parents and community.
Easy enough for me?
Joel, I think you're going to be all right with it.
Mrs. Serrano.
Thanks for this presentation, Dr. Gilbert, and of course, everybody that's worked on this. I shouldn't say behind closed doors, because everybody's welcome to our planning meetings, of course, but I do want to share that a lot of time was put into this, and the team really did make it digestible for us board members to go through each of these chapters, so I appreciate that. Now, something that caught my attention, because we do launch live online on July 1st with the trust policy, and school starts on July 17th, Dr. Gilbert. I'm wondering, will we be able to meet the deadline as far as student handbooks? Because I know we have to work on the documents and the forms over the next year, but the way our current handbooks sit, they do include references to policy. So I was just wondering if we'll be able to work with the dates.
Yes, once you approved back in September, I had the team start working on the handbooks and making changes now. So we've been working on changes all the way since you approved in September so that we could be prepared on July 1.
And then my last question is in reference to the archiving of our ASBA-based policy. That will be, it's going to be archived, I understand, but will it be accessible only to like a restricted group, or is that public?
Being that it's policy, I believe I'll have to just double check that it would be public because it's public now, so I would make sure that we have it so that it's public.
Great, thank you.
It would be under, I'm sorry, Member Serrano, it would be under archived, because if we are referencing something that occurred possibly a year ago, we'll have to use the policy that that issue occurred under. So all of those policies will be archived so that we can go back and see what policy was in place.
Are there any other questions from the board? All right. Thank you, Dr. Gilbert. We appreciate all the work that you and your team and everyone else in the district has done on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And we will take a couple-minute break, and we will start again at 7:05.